Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. Today, we're back with our monthly Q&A series. There's been a lot of traveling going on lately, so we haven't had time to do this over on Locals in a couple months, but we're back. And the way this is going to work is the first half of these are going to be on YouTube, Rumble, X, all of our platforms. The second half will be for local subscribers only. We have a number of questions from you already, but we are also going to take questions as they come in on YouTube, X. If you want to send a super chat, we'll raise you to the top of the queue. And of course, local subscribers, all of your questions will be answered over there. And to begin, we had a very interesting question we had a bunch of videos done a while ago about the use of Latin, how to learn Latin. Of course, a big focus of this channel is the traditional Latin Mass. And a question we got was, what about pronunciation? I think medieval pronunciation sounds better than the classical one, but which Latin pronunciation should we use? And that's a very interesting question. So those who don't know is that there are different ways of pronouncing Latin. So of course, Latin is going to be written almost the same way. Sometimes you'll find variations. Some of it's all caps. Sometimes a different script is used, but the way it's pronounced is actually different based on really the setting. So the one that we're used to, and the one that the traditional Latin Mass uses, the one we're used to in traditional liturgical settings, really, every time you'll hear Latin in the setting of the Catholic Church, you'll hear what's called ecclesiastical pronunciation, which to most people should just be normal Latin you've heard. So your V's are pronounced as a V, your AEs are going to be pronounced as A, and it's going to sound fairly normal. It sounds very Italian, actually. And that's ecclesiastical pronunciation. That finds its roots back when the Roman Empire was collapsed. Really, all of these different Romance languages, which find their roots in the Latin language, they developed their own dialects. There are different ways of pronouncing Latin. And Charlemagne actually established a very solidified way of pronouncing Latin in his time. And gradually, the Church, with some variation, adopted this formal way of pronouncing Latin in the ecclesiastical form. And so that's why it's universal. No matter where you go in the world, you'll hear the Latin Mass pronounced in the same way. Now, the other kind of pronunciation is the classical pronunciation, which there's variations there. Recently there's the Calabrese pronunciation, which is a bit different, but that's going to sound a little bit funny, the classical pronunciation, to somebody who may have only heard brief bits of Latin. For example, their V's are pronounced as W's. So, you'd pronounce in the Julius Caesar quote, you'd pronounce, Weni instead of Veni, right? It sounds a bit strange. Their AEs are pronounced as I. So if you had like multiple eagles, for example, it would be Aquilae rather than Aquilae in the ecclesiastical. So it's very different. And what I would say, which one should we use? Well, the Church has decided that we need to use ecclesiastical pronunciation when it comes to liturgical settings. If you're in academic settings, reading the Aeneid or these different classical works, sure, I think there's merit, especially in finding the meter in certain of these works to know the classical pronunciation. But if you're learning Latin, especially for having a better understanding of the Mass, of our great Latin tradition, I would learn ecclesiastical, and you don't really have to worry about classical pronunciation that much. And so much of the old learning materials for Latin are in that ecclesiastical pronunciation anyway, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But did you have any comments on that one, Brian?
No, agree with all the details that you said. If I maybe just go up a little bit, sort of broader picture, I think the question raises, two important points to remember. One is something that Pope Pius XII warned us against in his encyclical on the Mass, Mediator Dei. And that's because you'll hear some people like, well, classical Latin's older. We should go back. I haven't even heard people at traditional Masses. Oh, well, we now have this knowledge of what it was in the first century. And he warned us against what he called a false antiquarianism. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's important for traditionalists to remember this point, because we like tradition. We like things in the past. But he said we like them because they survived, that the Church pruned the tradition, kept them alive, And we don't have a sense of like the older the better necessarily. Like, oh, if we could find out how they did it in the first century, we should go back to that. He says some traditions were good to sort of develop a way and the church to guide them. And, that's what I think. You don't want to fall into that trap, right? And that's what the Novus Ordo innovators did. Oh, we found this manuscript of Hippolytus, by the way, while he was a heretic, who wrote a summary of the Eucharistic prayer, and that's what he used. So we should use that and turn it into a new canon. That's what Pius XII really warned us against. So, maybe academics want to argue about this. For the mass, the church for over 1,000 years has set this issue, and that's the way it should be. And then, as even to itself, if you're in academic circles about it, about what classical Latin really was, as you mentioned, first of all, there's not complete agreement on it. Let's remember, we're not in a science fiction film. Nobody has gone back in a time machine to actually listen to Julius Caesar or Cicero. So these are, scholars doing their best, using certain keys and clues and rhythm and text to guess or make hypotheses about what it sounded like. So whatever they say is a theory about what it sounded like. But what we have in ecclesiastical Latin is a living language, right? That is, the church has preserved, and we know how it sounds because it uninterruptedly has continued, as opposed to just trying to reconstruct it.
Yeah, and one last quick point on it. Some people might ask, well, why is this important? How can we even say it's living language? Even at the Second Vatican Council, the council fathers were speaking to each other in Latin, oftentimes. Yeah. So, I mean, there's some cases where, some notable cardinals and bishops had a very weak knowledge of Latin, but, for the most part, you have bishops speaking to each other in ecclesiastical Latin. So it's an integral part of what makes Catholics who we are. And so it does need to be taken seriously. A second question, also relating to the Second Vatican Council, maybe you can take this one, Brian. Does the SSPX recognize the Second Vatican Council? Of course, that's a bit of a broad question, but yes. What does the SSPX have to say about that? Of course, the SSPX is Society of St. Pius X, for those who don't know. What do they have to say about it, Brian?
So I'm going to be law professor here a little bit. It depends what you mean by recognize, right? That's kind of and you'll get a lot of people, do you recognize the Second Vatican Council? Well, what do you mean by that, right? So on the most basic level, the Priestly Society of St. Pius X recognizes that it was an historical event. Like, they don't deny that it happened, right? Because this is sort of when people say, do you recognize the Second Vatican Council? Well, yeah, it was an event. It occurred from 1962 to 1965. I don't know what you're talking about. No, nobody's denying that. Now, second level, do you recognize that it was a council of the church? Like, do you say there were only 20 ecumenical councils? And there again, the Society of St. Pius X's answer is yes, it was an ecumenical council of the church. Now you're going to find this one. Then we go to the next level. Do you recognize it has some authority within the church? And there the answer is they would say yes, according to the documents themselves, to what extent they asserted authority. So that's where it's now going to get a little more complicated than yes and no, because the question, and we've talked about this before, that every statement of the magisterium is not of an equal weight and cannot be recognized of an equal weight, right? The Pope having a dinner conversation, or even the Pope teaching catechism, if he did to a couple of young children, would be of a different weight of authority that have to be recognized than an encyclical or a papal bull, etc. And even before the Second Vatican Council, there are parts of and documents and writings of councils that are of varying degrees of authority. There are those that are considered extraordinary magisterium, irreformable, infallible. Those are the decrees, the canons, which are invoke infallibility. They are the anathemas that bind the faithful. But then, again, even in Trent, I have no criticisms of Trent, there are further explanations and texts that surround them that are certainly valuable and of the magisterium, but they are not extraordinary magisterial statements. So even within the documents of Trent, for example, the theologians will identify, this we recognize as extraordinary magisterium, infallible, this not. And the Priestly Society of St. Pius X says, same thing with the Second Vatican Council. The difference with the Second Vatican Council, unlike all 20 that came before it, is it never invoked infallibility. It never stated anathemas. It never used the formal language to make the statements in a form that is infallible. And we knew this from the very beginning. They, rather than calling it a council which is called to condemn errors, as all 20 were, it was called as a pastoral council, a novelty, an innovation. So it's recognized as a pastoral council. What that means is still open to debate. It was a term nobody really understood at the time. It was a novelty. But everyone understood it meant, well, if it's something over here that's ill-defined, then we know it's not this. And none of the documents contain like these clear dogmatic invocations. Now, people want to simplify this who want an either or, right? It's either infallible or it's nothing. Don't really understand, I think, the Catholic theology of the order of authorities, because it is much more complicated than that. So there are things that have level of infallibility, but there are things that are beneath it, but doesn't mean that they're of no value. They may be actually part of ordinary magisterium if they're compared to the past, and therefore be infallible under ordinary magisterium. They're repeating what's always and everywhere been said. They may be things that have been generally held but have not risen to that level yet, and therefore due theological respect and should not be questioned or challenged lightly. And then there are just sort of applications or prudential statements that are of a lower. And I'm not going through all the details theologically, just sort of jumping around to give an example. And so the Society of St. Pius X says there's nothing that Catholics are bound to hold as infallible. To the extent, and this was Archbishop Lefebvre's sort of mantra about the council, he accepted the documents of the Second Vatican Council to the extent they were consistent with tradition, by which he explained he meant if there was anything that repeated what the church had always taught, and there are individual statements in the documents which do that, he accepted them, not because the Second Vatican Council alone said it, but because it was consonant with tradition. Statements that are contradictory, that are completely novel, that contradict tradition, he said, cannot be accepted as part of the authentic magisterium. And statements which are ambiguous, first of all, we need to understand the point interpreted only the way that's consistent with tradition. And in fact, those statements, even if they can be interpreted that way, should be avoided because they create confusion. And so I think that's a summary of what the Society of St. Pius X means when they say they recognize the council, right? And we can't just have this sort of simple, just swear allegiance to the council and every bit of every word of it, and that's what you mean by recognize. And if you want more, they have a couple of their SSPX podcasts on the council, what it means, that go into this in certainly more detail. But that would be my kind of overview of what their position is.
Yeah, a very disappointing thing is how this, we hear a lot about dialogue today in the Catholic Church, but there's actually been a lack of dialogue on this particular subject, because, I mean, what Brian just said there, that position is the Catholic teaching. You're comparing theological notes and magisterial weight to teachings to figure out what actually binds you as a Catholic. The issue is with many points of the Second Vatican Council, not just many of the documents, but many of the individual statements within the documents, there is a complete multitude of different interpretations about various statements. A good example is in Dignitatis Humanae, when we're saying every man has the right to religious liberty. Well, even if of all of the defenders of that statement, many of them have contradictory views. Some of them, like Ratzinger, will say this is rooted in man's free will to be able to worship in a false religion, and that he can't be impeded from doing that outside of a vague extraordinary circumstance that violates public order. Other people will say that that has nothing to do with being rooted in free will, but this is due to the church not having rights of coercion over people. And so even there, that disagreement, which you see frequently, that shows that there's not a clear understanding or even an interpretation of these ambiguous statements within the Second Vatican Council. And so when someone says, do you accept the Second Vatican Council? Well, somebody naturally has to say, well, what do you mean? What interpretation are we having to look at? Is this just a blanket, everything is in is in continuity with tradition, because if it manifestly isn't, and there's no binding, infallible authority to make us say that it is, well, there's no reason to take that position that everything in the Second Vatican Council is 100% in continuity with tradition, if there are those worrisome points that we don't even know what the interpretation is. And so this is something that people are going to have to, the hierarchy of the church, if it's ever going to want to get out of this rut and move past these superficial understandings of the Second Vatican Council, it's going to have to actually converse with the Society of St. Pius X and with traditional critics to figure out, what do these documents even mean, and what are the theological notes attached to them compared to the ones of prior magisterial teaching. But another similar question that I think really does tie into this, Brian, is somebody asked us, especially in regards to the latest video we did, one of the latest videos we did on the SSPX possibly uniting with Rome in sometime in the future. We talked about some of the preconditions relating to that, how that might play out. But one viewer asked, why does the Society of St. Pius X want to reconcile with Rome if they know they will just get the same treatment as the Fraternity of St. Peter? What do you make of that, Brian?
Great question. And again, I think we have to draw some distinctions. So the Society of St. Pius X, because they are Catholic, obviously desires a reconciliation with the Roman authorities. And again, I like to say that's the way Archbishop Lefebvre spoke. He didn't say Rome, because I think that they would say they are reconciled with Rome. They are united with Rome because they're Catholic. But the particular Roman authorities, they have disagreements with and have technical, canonical discrepancies with, right? And I think, like any Catholic, they would want those to be resolved. So it'd sort of be like if you had a bad parent who did some bad things to you, maybe, and you had some arguments with them over the years, and maybe they're still having some trouble, and you say, well, I can't. There's certain things I can't do with them because it's danger to my faith, but I desire to reconcile them with them. I wish that we could, put these things behind us. Even if it may not be possible right now. So why would they desire it? Fundamentally is because they're Catholic. And the fact that they do still say we wish this could be the case, even if it's not practical right now or possible, proves that they are Catholic. Because if they're not Catholic, they'd say, well, I don't really care who you are. There's nothing to reconcile with you because I'm my own church, right? Now, the second part of your question, why would they want to do this if they're going to be treated like the FSSP, is I think the answer to why they haven't achieved their desire so far. And it's because it's funny, back in 2012, I remember a really good priest who is currently a district superior of a major continent right now saying to me, when I said, well, is this going to happen? Do you think a practical agreement, that's what it was called then, a practical agreement where Rome will de jure. De jure means like according to the letter of the law, recognize you, as opposed to de facto, which is what we live in. De facto, the church authorities recognize them as Catholic, but they do not sort of by the letter of the law. And I said, do you think that'll happen? And he said, well, here's the problem. It'll only happen if it's something sustainable. He said, there's no point to signing an agreement one day that will have to the next day say, well, just throw it out because now you're like, we'll sign an agreement one day and the next day they'll say the new mass. And we'll say, well, no, we're going to take the agreement away. Okay, I guess you'll take the agreement away because that we can't do that. So he said, there's no point in entering into some practical arrangement or practical recognition or agreement if it's not built on something sustainable, because we're not going to compromise. We are not going to start saying, Digitatis Humanae has no problems, or there's no ambiguity in the Second Vatican Council, or the new mass is good and legitimate. And therefore, if that's your expectation, we don't want you to recognize us so that we have to immediately say, let's go back to the way we were, because there's no point in that. And, that's on the doctrinal level primarily, that they sort of recognize the concerns raised by the Society of St. Pius X are legitimate. And even on the practical level. I remember Bishop Fillet, in giving a conference, said, one of the sine qua nons on the practical side is they have to own all the churches. And he said, because what we've learned from the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King, if we don't, the diocesan bishop can just throw us out tomorrow. So we could have this beautiful agreement with Rome, and the next day, half our churches be shut down. And we cannot put our society in that kind of position. So as a practical matter, and then he pointed out, it was funny at the time, it was kind of humorous. He said, I don't think they're even ready to talk about practical matters because they haven't really thought through things. Because they did a draft, he explained, of what this might look like. And it said at one point, any location where the Society of St. Pius X currently celebrates Mass is immediately recognized as a Catholic church. And he said, well, that's interesting. And he started listing off. He says, we say Mass at the Sheraton Hotel Ballroom in this place. And we say in the community center. And then it's like, you really want to recognize those as Catholic churches? He's like, he said, I don't think they're even ready to talk about it because they don't really understand what we do. Like what's going on to just make a statement like that. He said, shows that they're just sort of talking about things without even really appreciating the details. So I think unlike some other groups who, in my opinion, sadly rushed to an agreement and didn't really think some of these things through and are now suffering the consequences of that sometimes, at least so far, up until now, the leadership of the society has said, we desire this, but we will only do it when it's done right because we want it to be once and for all.
Yeah. And something that I think is going to be coming up more and more, because a reminder, this can be, I know, a bit tedious for some people, but I'll say it here. We are not the Society of St. Pius X. Even if we attend their masses, we can't speak for them necessarily. And I know, look, a lot of lay people put their heart and soul into supporting those priests, but at the end of the day, that's, it's their prerogative. But I think this is an important thing for everybody to keep in mind, because these controversies will come up, especially as these discussions start popping up again with Rome and the society. But if we had a sort of doctrinal status quo where Rome says, as you are, you're fine, right? We're not going to scrutinize you. A actual legal agreement would still be beneficial really for everybody within the Society of St. Pius X. I mean, the obvious thing is you wouldn't be facing the schismatic allegations that are absurd from certain people who are very vindictive against the Society of St. Pius X. But you would all,
you're a little optimistic. I think that might go on anyway. There's some people
true. I suppose so. But it would be such an evident thing that I think even the most legalistic people would sort of have to be on the more on the margins, and being able to actually have that more of a Catholic integrated sense, where even a lot of the academics within society circles, within traditional Catholic circles, can start scrutinizing the Second Vatican Council more openly, can start scrutinizing the Novus Ordo more openly. That really all comes from a legal agreement. But again, it has to be done where there's no compromise, where the society says, yeah, everything's fine in the Second Vatican Council, everything's fine in the new Mass. But with this, I don't think that's out of the question. But what I'm concerned with, and this has been a concern for the past 15 years, really, is there are some people who say that if there is a practical agreement, that in and of itself shows the SSPX is compromised. That even if the Rome recognized the society as being, fine to take their positions, it would still be wrong to reconcile with the Vatican because of what the Vatican has been doing. I just don't think that follows, though. I don't think that is. There is no compromise on the part of somebody if you don't compromise. Catholics are in communion with the Holy Pontiff. If we recognize the Pontiff as being a true successor of St. Peter, well, we are in communion with him. So that's my take on it. Of course, that gets into the Sedevacantist debate. It's too much to get into here. But for those who recognize the hierarchical authorities as being the legitimate, valid authorities, it does not follow that we shouldn't have anything to do with them if they recognize the society as they are. So, well, again, I think the society superiors know what they're doing, and we'll see how it plays out. Another question we got here in the live chat from Michael is, do you think the SSPX helps or hurts the unity of the local church? And how do you feel about them having their own churches and funding separate from the diocesan system? Well, I think on the latter point, it's actually much better to to be separated from the diocesan system, really in the same way that there's even a parallel when it comes to Byzantine priests, because fundamentally there's things are done so differently within the Society of St. Pius X than it is at the local diocesan structure. As Brian alluded to there, I don't think many of the diocesan workers and the diocesan priests and the bishops would even know how to deal with, or how to treat, how to handle the Society of St. Pius X priests. I don't think they can't even fathom some of the things that are going on, the amount of real traditional Catholicism there. And I think, as Brian said, it's much safer for the society to have those the churches on their own. When it comes to the unity of the local church, look, it is sad to see, even among traditionalists. I mean, the famous case, right, is a terrible a diocese full of awful masses gets a society chapel, a society priest comes in, and then the diocesan bishop says, "Oh no, we don't want people going to that Latin mass. We'll invite the Fraternity of St. Peter in, and then many of the people who were going to the society will go over to the fraternity, and there you do have some division, you have some mutual hatred." I don't think that needs to be the case. This is another reason why I think an actual agreement as the society is would be beneficial to the traditional Catholic movement. And look, there doesn't need to be that hatred, but we live in a crisis in the church where it's simply dangerous. The faith is not being spread properly in the local diocese, where these extraordinary circumstances that these priests are going into, it's simply necessary in order to have the faith given out properly for the salvation of the laity. So it's something that it's not an ideal situation. I think some people mistake that. Some people say that the society is saying the situation they're in is ideal. I don't think anybody would really say that. But the situation simply must be done where there is an obvious case where the faith isn't being handed on properly in the local diocese. And so I think those measures are simply the society having to protect itself. So we've been talking a lot about the society, but do you have any further thoughts on that, Brian?
No, I mean, I agree. And first, I would just say, historically, it is not strange or abnormal for a religious order or institute to own their own churches. I mean, that's happened throughout the history of the church, and have their own funding separate from the diocese, the Benedictines, for example. So in and of itself, there's nothing disunifying about that. There never was for centuries. But on the broader point, because I do get your broader point that, it is, it does pose, at least in appearance, a disunity. But I think I would paraphrase St. Augustine to say, if there is, it's not coming from the Society of St. Pius X. It is a tragedy caused by the way the authorities in many dioceses are acting. And, if you've never been to a mass, it's funny. The first time we went, people, they go there, all they're going to do is harangue about the local bishop and trash him and actually not what we found anywhere at all. Now, I'm sure somebody will find some exception, some grouchy old priest who's ready to be retired who happened to do it one day. But in general, they don't speak about the diocese, the bishop, very much. They pray, they say his name in the canon. They have a picture of him. They acknowledge him. They'll mention a few, but honestly, it's not their focus. It's not their focus on let's create disunity. And they just take the prudent course of just not talking about it, right? And talk about the faith and give sermons. So, ironically, it's more often a diocesan priest or an ecclesia dei priest denouncing the society and creating disunity than the other way around. Again, in my experience, in the last 20 years, we've been in tradition, 28 years, I found more of that sort of disunifying speech not emanating from society priests. And I think they would say that, if there's disunity, it's because it's being created by you, because you, against the law, against natural justice, removed our official authorization, are treating us in a way that's not just, and that's what's creating the division.
Right. And it comes down to, I think many of these issues comes down to, are when you have an unjust law and you have an unjust spirit attached to the law, are we still going to be obliged to obey it, even if it causes a harm to our souls? There's a great book by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. I can't remember what it's called. It's something about it's disobedience in the title, but he's written quite extensively on this, and the society has as well. So again, lots of comments about the society on this one. For those who are still watching, we're going to switch over to locals right now for our local subscribers. Answer the questions over there. If you're here on YouTube, though, ask your questions in the comments, and we can answer them next month when we host this other half next month on YouTube, Rumble, or X. We check all of our platforms, so any of the platforms, you can ask your comments there. But from all of us here at Catholic Family News, thanks for watching, and we'll see you over at Locals.